The Japanese Policy of Sakoku was ratified and enacted by Shogun Iemitsu in 1633 and lasted until the middle of the 19th century. This policy, coupled with the revolutionary way Japan administered itself from the beginning of the 17th century, created more or less 250 years of peace and secured Japan a corner of the world relatively free from the rest of the world's drama and issues. So why, after 250 years, did Japan almost overnight make the drastic change from being closed and hard-nosed about learning from the West to being totally open and trying to learn and adapt from the West as fast as it could? There is more than one reason why Japan suddenly opened its doors to the world so enthusiastically. These reasons burgeon from both internal and external factors. However, before we go into the reasons for why Japan opened itself to the world, it is necessary we delve into why it closed itself to the world. In 1633, Japan created and enforced the policy of Sakoku. They did this because they felt it would help shield Japan from Western influence on their relatively stable feudal archipelago. Japan, although very self-concerned and inward-looking, still had a good idea of how manipulating the West could be once invited into a foreign land. Japan itself had experienced this when the Spanish and the Portuguese landed in southern Japan prior to the policy. An alarming number of Catholic converts could be noted. Furthermore, much of the population exposed to the introduction of the strange foreigners were extremely interested in the firearms they brought with them. The concept of guns to the samurai, the uppermost class in the Japanese feudal system, was fearsome to say the least, for they were aware of the serious disturbance to the hierarchy they had been accustomed to for centuries. A peasant on his own couldn't kill or harm a samurai, but with just 10 minutes of learning how to use a musket, he could kill him in the blink of an eye. So, with the fear of being colonized, converted and killed, Japan almost completely closed itself off to the world for almost 250 years. Fast forward to the 1830s. The Tempo era 1830 to 1844, named such in commemoration of a great fire in Edo and an earthquake in Kyoto, the era is considered by many to be the first steps towards the end of the Bakufu government. The name of the era, Tempo, meaning Heavenly Imperial Protection, is somewhat ironic because following the naming of the era was over a decade of extreme hardship and adversity as famine, disease, and natural disasters devastated the country. As a result of the adversity Japan was going through, many riots and pilgrimages occurred on a scale never before seen. Noticing the considerable distress of the people, the upper-class samurai, in charge of controlling any violence which was at the time fearfully impeding, gave anxious suggestions for reforms to the ruling elite. Some more drastic than others, one of the more extreme of which called for the colonizing North to account for the high population. Others simply complained to the ruling class about how poorly they were doing their job. In any case, these events that were occurring frequently over the country made the ruling class realize just how dangerous a mass of people with a collective view could be, and also gave them the daunting prospect that the country as they knew it was falling apart in front of them. With Japan falling apart internally, the increasingly curious Western government began to hassle Japan about organizing a trading treaty more and more aggressively. However, before the West became disgruntled and aggressive, they did try more gentle and friendly ways of getting their proposition across. In 1837, Charles W. King, an American merchant, sailed to the entrance of Edo Bay in an attempt to open trade with Japan by returning 7 Japanese castaways that were picked up a few years prior. The ship trying to enter the bay clearly had peaceful intentions as it was disarmed, but even so, was fired upon before even making it into the bay. This showed the aggression that Japan was willing to put forward in order to stay isolated. Fast forward to July 1853. Matthew C. Perry, in charge of the East India Squadron, has arrived at the mouth of Edo Harbor with the intentions of offering a trade treaty whether the Japanese liked it or not. They denied Perry initially, but after firing a few shots from his cutting-edge cannons into some buildings, the Japanese knew with a sharp pang of realization that they were completely outclassed and as good as defenseless against the foreigners' high-tech weapons. Although Japan knew they were outclassed in every way by the West, they still knew that they had the option to decline the militarily superior Westerners the opportunity to organize trade relations despite the evident bombardings they would get. However, it was quickly decided that this would be out of the question by taking note of what foreigners' gunboat diplomacy can do to a country, particularly a stubborn one, by using China and the early years leading up to the Taiping Rebellion as an example of the potential consequences. And so with this in mind, being totally outclassed by the West and with nowhere to run, the Japanese conceded and discussed trade relations with the Americans. This was just the start, however, of a snowball effect that would completely open up Japan to the rest of the world. Although the original treaty discussed was relatively modest, in 1854 the Americans tried to convince the Japanese to open up Japan to the Americans completely by arguing that the Japanese would fare better with their American friend and mentor than with the British. This proved to be more difficult than before. With the absence of warships, they had no help to persuade the Japanese. But because of the situation the Japanese were in anyway, they had little option but to, in 1858, accept the treaties offered by the West on almost all terms. Although Japan was now completely opened up to America, their concept of Sakoku was still being enforced. The reason why Japan had opened its doors to America was because it was being compelled to given its predicament. It would take the best part of a decade before Japan truly opened up to the West and made it its mission to learn as much from the West as possible, as fast as possible. It was finally realized that only by learning from the West would Japan be able to control its own destiny. In conclusion, the years leading up to the Tempo era were spent in diligent comfort by most Japanese. It was from then on, however, that things began to change. Japan, struck with hardship caused by natural disasters and famine, became restless, and its ruling system slowly fell apart. Towards the end of the Tempo era, Japan, now ripe for an overthrow, eventually got it, and it came in the form of Matthew C. Perry.